And we will now segue to our second topic this evening or this afternoon in the States, which is with Dr. Naomi Cohn Zentner, who is a lecturer in Jewish music at the Schechter Institute Graduate School and also at the Schechter Rabbinical Seminary. And her topic is the music of Shavuot, from the famous to the obscure. Naomi, bevakasha.
Toda rabba. Thank you very much, Rav David. Today, the title I've been given is the music of Shavuot, from the popular or mainstream to the obscure. But actually, we're going to be focusing a lot on the obscure. For those of you who keep the second day of Shavuot, a strange thing might happen to you after studying the first pasuk of the Haftara. So you have the first pasuk from the Book of Havoc, and then suddenly you may come across the following piyut. It starts off like this. So this is from your regular old art scroll. Well, after you have your first pasuk from Sefer Habakkuk, Perek Bet, suddenly many say the following Yativ Pitgam in the Haftara. Again, in the Haftara, meaning we've started the Haftara, and suddenly we have a piyut in Aramaic, which is already outstanding, and a piyut in the middle of our Haftara reading. So this whole thing sounds quite strange, and it may remind you of a different kind of piyut, which is also said on Shavuot. On Shavuot, besides this piyut, which is in Aramaic, we have another piyut in Aramaic. This is said on the second day, Haftara. The other one is the piyut called Akdamut Milin, which is said on the first day, just before the Torah reading of the first day. So Akdamut Milin is attributed to Rabbi Meir Schatz, Schatz meaning possibly a Shliach Tzibur from Worms from the 11th century. And there are a few melodies for this tune. Since we're speaking of music, there we might be hearing some music, so please prepare yourselves. So this, in a way, is the equivalent to what we saw before, this piyut, also in Aramaic, Yativ Pitgam, which is a piyut reshut. Both Akdamut Milin and Yativ Pitgam, the piyut which we're speaking about today, are a piyut called reshuyot. Reshuyot is kind of asking permission or prelude, and they're actually asking permission or inviting the translation of the Haftara in the case of Yativ Pitgam, or the Torah in the case of Akdamut Milin. So it's an introduction to the translation of the Bible, of the Torah reading, or of the Haftara into Aramaic. So that's quite a strange thing. First of all, why do we have piyutim which are introducing us to the Aramaic translation of the Torah reading or the Aramaic translation of the Haftara? We have an Aramaic piyut introducing these things, but actually we have stopped using the Aramaic translation of the Torah or of the Haftara many, many years ago, meaning this is something, the custom itself is obsolete, but the piyut remains. So first of all, as a musicologist, I have to say, sometimes there are musical reasons for things, meaning when there's a nice tune, we know that sometimes even customs which don't make sense continue, and I think that Kol Nidrei may be a good example if you want to think of one where the music is so strong and the tune is so poignant and is so meaningful that even if the text is seen as problematic, it will still continue to be said because the melody has such a special meaning in people's hearts. So this may be for a musicological reason, for a musical reason, since the tunes were so nice. But we're going to try and think about this whole second day Yontif, because this is something which happens on the second day of Yontif. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about this piyut called Yativ Pitgam, and its equivalent called Akdamut Milin. Both are for Shavuot. So Akdamut Milin, here's a nice picture for Shavuot. Akdamut Milin has a few melodies. There's the famous German Jewish melody, na 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 da na 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 da 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 na 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 da 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 na na na. This is one tune which is used for Akdamut Milin. The German Jews are very good at recycling, and they use the same tune for a few different topics. For example, they'll use it for Hallel, and they will use it for Hodu, as we see here in a book from Frankfurt from 1912, where you have Hodu l'Adonai ki tov ki le'olam chasdo yomana Israel. And so we know this tune is used by the German Jews for Hallel. It's also used as Shir Hamalaus Beshuv Hashem et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kecholmim Azim Alesechok Pinu, etc., etc. So the same tune is used as kind of a musical motif of the time by German Jews. For Shavuot, this is the tune of Shavuot. Other tunes will be used on Pesach, and yet other ones will be used on Sukkot, etc. But that is the German Jewish tradition of Akdamut Milin. If we want to look at the Eastern European tradition of Akdamut Milin, this is a tradition which actually may sound quite familiar to you, since it's the same tune we use for Kiddush, for Yativ. Akdamut Milin, maybe I get the words. הקדמות מילין ושריות שוטה, אבל השקל נהרמנו שוטה. So it sounds a little bit like na 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 כיוונו בחרת, ואותנו קידשת מכל העמים, מועדי קודשך, בשמחה ובששון הנחלתנו. So we're using the same tune for הקדמות מילין is used for a variety of kiddushim, also kiddush for Pesach, Kiddush, for Sukkot and Shavuot, of course, but even for Rosh Hashanah. This is the same special Yontiv Kiddush which is used, and it's based on the tune of Akdamut Milin according to Eastern European musical tradition. So that is Akdamut Milin. And Akdamut Milin, in a way, is quite equivalent to the same as to the piyut which we're talking about today, Yativ Pitgam, which is a lot less famous. Its PR was a lot less successful than the Akdamut Milin. And the Yativ Pitgam, le'at udgam, beribo rivevan irin. So this is, of course, again in rhyme. If we see that there's a rhyme here for Akdamut Milin, we see here there's a very big ta. You see there's a very big ta, because every single one of the lines ends with the same rhyme. Akdamut Milin v'sharyut shuta, avla shekel nahamanu shuta. So here we have a ta at the very end, and here we have rin, rin at the very end of the line, which is also a rhyme. And so they are both piyutim, which are in Aramaic, and they're both introducing the translation of the Aramaic. So this raises a few questions. First of all, we need to ask about the Haftara. The Yativ Pitgam is a piyut, which is an introduction to the translation of the Haftara. It appears in a Machzor Vitri, and here I have a picture of my fingers touching a real Machzor Vitri. This one is from the 14th century, and I was lucky enough, fortunate enough to be able to research it in Oxford about a year and a half ago. So there's a picture of the actual handwritten Machzor Vitri. But before we look at our Yativ Pitgam, we have to ask, why was the Haftara? Why was it translated? And Bichlal, when was the Haftara established? When did we start reading the Haftara and not just be happy with the Torah portion? And so then we understand, after we understand why we have the Haftara, we can ask ourselves, why was the Haftara translated? Why did it need to be translated? Why did Torah need to be translated? Another question is, why do we have a piyut? Why do we need a piyut to introduce the translation? And the final question is, why is the second day of Shavuot an appropriate time for singing this piyut? We know that Akdamut Milin is actually sung it's said on the first day, right before the reading of the Torah. So why not say this piyut, this special Yativ Pitgam, introduction to the Haftara, to the translation of the Haftara? Why not do that also on the first day of Shavuot? It would seem as though that would be the appropriate time to do to say this kind of piyut, if we do the same thing for the Torah portion as well. So there are several theories to explain when the Haftara was established. There are a few different theories. We're not going to go into all of them. One of them is that this is a response to the persecution of the Jews underneath Antiochus. So the Maccabee revolt was also preceded by a prohibition to read the Torah. And so in lieu of being able to read the Torah, the Haftara was initiated, in which every portion of the Torah actually finds some kind of equivalent in the prophets, which is something which can remind us what the parasha would have been had we been able to read the parasha. So there is a theory that this was read every week instead of the parasha of that week. Another theory is that after certain disasters or persecutions where the Torah scrolls were destroyed in certain communities, and we know you're not allowed to read the Torah from anything but a proper kosher parchment scroll. They were able to substitute the Torah reading by reading certain portions of the prophet. We don't really know exactly when and how it was established, but all we know is by the time of Rabbah, so we're the 3rd century, there was already a scroll of Haftarot. So that we know that by the 3rd century, it already had become an established custom to read from the Haftara of the week. Now, why was it translated? We know that during the time of the Mishnah, both the Torah and the Haftara used to be translated into the spoken language. At that time, it was Aramaic, so that people could understand what it is that they were reading. The Torah we used the translation of Onkelos, and for the Navi, we used the translation of Yonatan ben Uziel. Remember that name, Yonatan ben Uziel? We're going to be returning to him soon. So after every one pasuk in Hebrew, the Metargem, the translator, would come up and he would translate one pasuk into Aramaic. And at some stage, we know that at some stage after the Talmud, it stopped being customary to translate the entire Torah and the entire Haftarah, but we still know that for a while, around the year 1000, the translation of the Haftarah was so important that if there was no translator around available, they would refrain from saying the Haftarah altogether. That's how important it was. At the time of the Baalei Tosafot, so the 12th and 13th century, only the Haftarot of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, the Shalosh Regalim, were translated into Aramaic. And in the Machzor Vitri, we have these Piyutei Reshut. This is the picture of the Machzor Vitri, and they were both written as a prelude to the translation. So Akdamut Milin is said on the first day of Shavuot, before the reading of the Torah, and our piyut is called Yativ Pitgam. Both of them are in Aramaic, and both of them are used to introduce the translation of the Torah or the Haftarah into Aramaic, which is a custom which has now become obsolete. And we do know that there are still in use some piyutei reshut. For example, the piyut reshut for Chatan Torah and the reshut for Chatan Bereshit on Simchat Torah, where we call up the Chatan Torah and we call up the Chatan Bereshit. If you remember, it goes Amod, 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 all right? So this is the na, 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 na. It's also in the same tune of Akdamut. So there's a musical connection between both of these reshuyot, both of these reshut piyutim. And the Machzor Vitri also includes the translations of the Pesach and the Shavuot Haftara readings into Aramaic. So it's interesting that at this time it still was something which was customary, specifically for the Shalosh Regalim. On Shalosh Regalim, that's when you translate your Haftara into Aramaic. Why? That's a good question. The question is better than any answer I can ask. So now that we've solved the first 3 questions. I mean, again, the question of why is there a piyut to introduce the translation, they seem to be sung specifically on Shavuot as a way to respect the Torah and the beginning of the cycle of the Torah, the receiving of the Torah, something which is very much connected to the day, to Shavuot, as the Chag Matan Torah. And so this is something which lends itself also to being for piyutim, to be written about it especially. And it was given, in the beginning also, there was an issue of saying the first pasuk of Kriyat Torah, and then bringing in the whole piyut, meaning it should be in the Torah reading before the first pasuk is translated. Remember, the first pasuk would be said in Hebrew with the ta'amim, and then you would have the translation in Aramaic. So in between the pasuk and the translation, that is where the piyut comes to introduce the translation and to respect the translator and to talk about how fortunate we are to receive the Torah, etc. And so it's interesting for us very much to see how this came to become quite quite popular, and Akdamut Milin is still with us and still sung in many communities. They don't start the first pasuk and then do the piyut. They've decided to do the piyut complete and then begin the Torah reading, so as not to do a hefsek, so as not to actually sort of separate the beginning and the first pasuk from the rest of the pasuk. But actually in Haftara, it's not considered such a terrible thing to separate the first pasuk of the Haftara from the rest of the pasukim. Okay, so this is, in this case, it would be to separate the pasuk from Chavakuk, Tfilah leChavakuk hanavi ala shigionot, and then you would start your piyut. But why is it the second day? We have lots of Manishtana questions today. Why is it the second day of Shavuot is more appropriate time for singing than the first? Why not to do it on the first day? The first day is when we have Akdamut Milin, the parallel piyut. So why not have the same custom for the second day? No, this is because the first day of Shavuot has an extremely important Haftara, the Haftara of Maaseh Merkava, Yechezkel, and it's seen as inappropriate to translate into Aramaic in the first place. They feared that the people would misunderstand this very mystical vision of Maaseh Merkava, etc. And so this was seen as very inappropriate and something which we don't want regular people to know of. And so therefore, we don't want it to be translated, and then we don't even want this special piyut for the translation to appear in this special place. And so therefore they relegated the piyut of Yativ Pitgam to the second day. The second day is the Book of Havoc. We won't go into the content so much, but it's interesting to see the actual piyut itself. This is the piyut, some of it, and soon we'll see the actual translation. There are several melodies which we have. And we're going to hear a few tunes for this piyut. And it's very important because, of course, in certain places, like in Israel, for example, many people don't go to the second, there's no second day of Shavuot, so there's no chance to hear this special melody. And it's quite interesting that we really lose quite a lot of things when we don't have a second day of Chag. Maybe before we hear these melodies, which some of them are very beautiful, we'll look here at the translation of Yativ Pitgam, and you see here they have actually separated the last syllable from the word, so that we see this rin rin rin, this interesting rhyme. And Yativ Pitgam was probably written by, we know it's the acrostic is Yair ben Meir, and we think it possibly was written by Rabbeinu Tam, the grandson of Rashi. It's interesting because really this is one of the piyutim, one of the many things that we lose when we stop keeping a second day of Yom Tov. So there are a few reasons why we stop keeping a second day of Yom Tov. Of course, anyone who lives in Israel has a home in Israel. I know many other Jews just feel that the second day is not as relevant, and so the first day is very stringently kept, while the second day less. So for whatever reason, the second day of Yom Tov, especially of the Shlosh Regalim, of course, of the three pilgrimage festivals, in many cases has stopped to be kept. And what is it that we lose when we stop keeping a second day of Yom Tov? So first of all, I have to say on a personal note, what we lose is the joy of having to prepare and celebrate a 3-day of Yom Tov. As a woman and a mother, I am telling you that this is one joy, which is it's okay. Since we don't have the second day of Yom Tov, we can dismiss ourselves from the mitzvah of having 6 meals to prepare with a family who doesn't always shower on Yom Tov. So this is a joy that we forgo. Okay, so that's the first thing that we lose when we stop keeping a second day of Yom Tov. Second, we miss and we lose all the haftarot for the second day of the 3 pilgrimage festivals. All of the haftarot which are said on the second day of Pesach, second day of Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeret, of course, and Shavuot, we kind of don't say them at all. We don't have an opportunity to say many special prayers, especially the piyutim, the krovot, the yotzrot. We don't always say them, but for example, this is a piyut which isn't a krovot or yotzrot. This is a piyut which anyone who doesn't have a second day of Shavuot will never even know it exists unless they go to the back, the appendix of their machzor, which is what I had to do to find it in my case of Rinat Israel, where it simply doesn't exist in the regular prayers. And of course, what we lose when we stop keeping a second day of Yontif is an entire Chag called Shmini Atzeret, which has its own melodies and its own tunes and its own minhagim, which is gone, disappeared, swallowed up by something called Simchat Torah. So much so that in Israel, it's even the notion of having two separate days is just mind-boggling, and having two zdarim even worse. Can't believe people actually do this. And of course, the special melodies, again, as a person who's interested in melodies, the special melodies which are sung only on the second day and night of the three pilgrimage festivals are gone. And here is a interview of Moshe Hildesheim, who was born in Hamburg. He was interviewed in Jerusalem in 1986 in the National Sound Archive you can find. And there he speaks about special tunes which no longer exist. In Israel, there's no Shmini Atzeret. So I sing this melody for Shir Ma'alot on Shabbat Chol HaMoed, because if you don't sing it, it gets lost. And here I think is a very heartfelt sentiment of someone who knows there's a special tune for Shmini Atzeret, but there's no more Shmini Atzeret. So what do? We'll use this tune in a different event, and we'll try and sing it so it doesn't get lost. So this is something which, again, lots of good things happen when you make Aliyah, but some things happen where you lose out on some of the very special diaspora culture, which was a part of people's lives, having a Shmini Atzeret, having a second seder, having tunes like Yativ Pitgam. So we're going to hear some of the melodies together. We have a few different tunes coming from a few different places. First, we will hear a recording of Cantor Abe Golinkin, who learned this tune in the cantorial school of Yeshiva University, and we'll hear his melody, which he sings for Yativ Pitgam. And let's hear it.
Number one. Yativ Pitgam le'atzut gam be'rivari be'vanivi haneyana b'minyana defaslina batuvin kadamahi negamahi neginunafik nehardinurin beturtaga neharshraga Vizikinur Varin Beraskam Akashaka Vimeshayan Nehavin Repikin Sava Belashitva Vegalyane Demitamrin.
Now we'll hear
version number 2.
A second version.
Also in the Ahava Rabbah Yitzi Piskam Le'asudegam Verivari Vevanivi Haneyana Viminyana Defaslina Batuvin Kadamahi Begamahi Nikidunafik Nehadinurin Viturtaga nehashraga Vizikinurva ulmin Virahusacha mabakashacha Vimeshayan neharin Rechikin sefa belashitva Vegayale demitamrin. This version goes 2 verses with the low tune and 1 with the high.
Okay, so I think we're going to remain with these 2 verses. I wrote in brackets what it reminded me of. It reminds me a bit of the Yigdal Elohim Chai Ve'ishtabach Nimetza Ve'enet El Metziuto. The beginning. Da 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 da. In a way, it reminds me a teeny bit of that tune. So I think we have Cantor Abe Golinkin with us, and thank you very much for recording these beautiful versions for us, again from melodies which we don't always have a chance to hear. We're going to hear now an example from the Hungarian Oberland by Gabrielle Belkovic. Let's hear a different version of this Yativ Pulkan.
Pitgam le yosudga riboy ribevan iri ane yana beminyana de foslin arboturi.
So this is just a short snippet of a different melody for Yativ Pitgam. And finally, we will hear another example of Dejo Gertner, also from Hungary. It was recorded in communist Hungary in the 1977. We'll hear this example too. I'm just going to stop it here. To me, this reminds me of a bit of Naham Ken Yetzel Sochen na 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 na. A little bit reminds me of the Omnan Ken melody, but it's very interesting how the rhythm is da la 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 la, da la 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 la, da la 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 la, la 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 la. It's kind of a waltz, and it's very pretty. So I think we're going to end here. This is the end of our session of obscure melodies. So today, there's no translation of the Torah and Haftara, and in some communities, there's no second day, which is a chance to sing these piyutim. But today, I hope we've done a little bit of a tikkun leil Shavuot, to try and remember certain of these musical traditions, which were very, very beautiful, and some of them, sadly, are not in use anymore. But if they are in your community, I'm very happy to hear they have a continued life. So thank you very much, and Chag Sameach.
Thank you, Naomi. Toda rabah. And again, thanks to my brother, Cantor Abe Golinkin, who's on this Zoom call.
Thank you very much, Cantor Abe.
Melodies of Yativ Pitgam. And I think that is the power of music, that these various melodies for a poem written in the 12th century by Rabbi Yaakov Tam, Rabbeinu Tam, have been carried on for hundreds and hundreds of years, even though the people singing them certainly did not understand the Aramaic that they were singing. And the same thing holds true for Akdamut, that most people today don't understand the Aramaic, but nonetheless they love the melody, which is of course also the melody of the Kiddush on Shalosh Regalim.